In this video, we'll learn another technique for solving quadratic equations called the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula says for a quadratic equation in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, x will be equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. This is a formula that you need to know, not only for this course, but for subsequent math and science courses. Our steps for solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula are as follows. You want to start by writing the equation in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equal to 0. You need to be equal to 0 and in descending order. Next, we identify a, b, and c. A is always the coefficient of the quadratic term, B is always the coefficient of the linear term, and C is always your constant value. We're going to plug the values of A, B, and C into the quadratic formula. Then we just need to clean things up. We'll simplify the radical, we'll simplify the overall fraction if possible. Let's solve x squared plus 3x minus 10 equals 0 using the quadratic formula. We need to start by getting it in the right form, equal to 0 and in descending order. Great, we have that. Next, let's identify a, b, and c. A is the coefficient of x squared, so a is 1. B is the coefficient of x, b will be 3. And c is our constant, negative 10. Now that we've identified a, b, and c, we need to plug them into the quadratic formula, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Make sure you're putting the whole expression over 2a. It's a common mistake that I see people only put the square root over 2a. It's all over 2a. All right, let's plug in. We're going to have x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 3 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 10 all over 2 times 1. Now we want to simplify things. Underneath the radical, we're going to square 3. That'll give us 9. Now we have negative 4 times 1 times negative 10. That'll be plus 40 all over 2 times 1, which is just 2. We can combine like terms under our radical. This will give us negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 49 all over 2. Next, we simplify the radical. Square root of 49, that's a perfect. So this is going to give us negative 3 plus or minus 7 all over 2. Notice that we have like terms in the numerator. I find that people are most successful simplifying this if, when you have like terms in the numerator, you break it up into two separate expressions, one for the plus 7 and one for the minus 7. So we're going to have x equals negative 3 plus 7 over 2 and x equals negative 3 minus 7 over 2. And then we simplify. Our first one, negative 3 plus 7, well, that gives us 4 over 2. We get x to be equal to 2. It's one of our solutions. Solving the other equation, negative 3 minus 7, that's negative 10 divided by 2. Our second solution is x equals negative 5. Next, let's solve 5x squared minus 1 equals 11. We want to start by getting it in the right form, which is equal to 0 and in descending order. So let's subtract 11 from both sides. This gives us 5x squared minus 12 equals 0. You'll notice that there is no linear term in this equation. You may want to put in a placeholder to help you correctly identify your A, B, and C. A is always the coefficient of x squared, so A is 5. B is always the coefficient of x. Since there was not a linear term, that means that B is equal to 0. We can see that clearly when we put in a placeholder. But if you choose not to put in the placeholder, if you're missing a term, then it's going to be 0 for A, B, or C. And then lastly, C is our constant term, which is negative 12. We've identified A, B, and C. We're ready to plug it into the formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. I encourage you to write the quadratic formula every time you do a problem until you have it memorized. So x is going to be equal to negative 0 plus or minus the square root of 0 squared minus 4 times 5 times negative 12 all over 2 times 5. It's time to clean up. We have negative 0 to start. Well, negative 0 is just 0, so we don't even need that. We're starting with plus or minus. Underneath the radical, we have 0 squared, which again is 0. Don't even need it. Negative 4 times 5 times negative 12. That gives us a positive 240. And then all over 10. Next thing to do is to simplify our radical. We're looking for the largest perfect square that's a factor of 240. That would be 16. Goes in 15 times. The square root of 240 simplifies to be 4 square root of 15. So we have x is equal to plus or minus 4 square root of 15 all over 10. The last thing we want to do is simplify the fraction overall. We can simplify our two numbers that are both outside of the radical, both divisible by 2. We get a final answer of x equals plus or minus 2 square root of 15 over 5. In our last example, we want to solve 4x squared plus 8x equals 3. First thing we need to do is get it set equal to 0. So we'll subtract 3 from both sides. 4x squared plus 8x minus 3 equals 0. We're in descending order, so we want to identify our A, B, and C. A is equal to 4, B is equal to 8, C is equal to negative 3. We plug these numbers into the quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. That'll be x equals negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared minus 4 times negative 3 all over 2 times 4. Doing a little cleanup here. We're going to have negative 8 plus or minus. Now, under the radical, 8 squared is going to be 64. Negative 4 times negative 3. That's going to give us a plus 48. All over 8 on the bottom. Combining like terms under our radical, we get negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 112 all over 8. We need to see if we can simplify our radical. Simplifying 112, we're looking for the largest perfect square that's a factor of 112. 16 goes in 7 times. This simplifies to be 4 square root of 7. So that gives us negative 8 plus or minus 4 square root of 7 all over 8. Next, we want to simplify the fraction overall. We simplify fractions by canceling common factors. So you could factor a 4 out of the numerator and then simplify common factors, but I find people are more successful if they break it up into 2 separate fractions. That's what I'm going to do here. We get x equals negative 8 over 8 plus or minus 4 square root of 7 over 8. 8 over 8, that's negative 1. And then remember, when you're dividing with radicals, you can simplify numbers that are both outside the radical together. Those numbers are both divisible by 4. We're going to get the square root of 7 over 2. Our final answer, x equals negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 7 over 2.